I am Abby Noy. I'm an extension educator, and I will be moderating the webinar today. And I would like to introduce you to our presenters today. First, we have Rachel Mote. Wave, Rachel, say hi. She earned her bachelor's from animal science from the University of Wisconsin River Falls and a master's in animal science from North Dakota State University. And she's currently pursuing her PhD here at the University of Minnesota. Some of you may know her as a Purina equine specialist. And she also likes to do 3-day eventing with her horse, Titan, who you can see there. We also have with us today Roger Moon. He is a...
That's me.
Let me get his information up here. Roger retired last year from the University of Minnesota as a professor of entomology after 36 years of research, teaching, and outreach. He earned his PhD in entomology from the University of California, Davis, and has studied the biology, ecology, and management of filth flies, disgusting, mosquitoes, lice, bed bugs, and mites that occur around livestock and people. Roger and his colleagues have published more than 130 articles, reviews, and book chapters, including papers on stable flies, swine mange, and the fly-borne spread of the PRRS virus, which affects the swine industry. Roger has taught or co-taught courses in veterinary entomology, medical entomology, veterinary parasitology, and other courses for undergraduate and graduate students here at the University of Minnesota. Roger consults regularly with researchers and educators and practitioners involved with livestock pest management throughout the nation, and we're happy to have him here. He made the bike ride down the hill to join us in Hacker Hall today. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. So Rachel, I will pass that along to you.
All righty. Thank you, Abby. So today, Roger and I are going to be giving you some information on how to control flies on your property and also how to improve the comfort of your horses during fly season, which we are about to enter. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is, are flies actually bothering my horse? So we have a little video to show you. Okay. So what we're seeing in this horse are behaviors pretty typical of fly annoyance in the horse and in livestock. So we see this horse is doing behaviors stomping, its legs are stamping. We see this horse is swishing its tail. Also, this horse will bring its head to its side and its forelimb, indicating it might be bitten or just annoyed by flies. And you also see a lot of muscular twitching going on. And so for us as horse owners, we need to think about, is this a problem and why? Well, something to think about for us horse owners is that flies can transmit and spread diseases and viruses, including things such as equine infectious anemia. Horses can damage the integrity of their hooves by doing this stomping. So it's something that during this season we want to pay attention to so we can keep our horses comfortable and provide a more hygienic type of environment for them to live in. So our next question, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Roger, we're going to talk about, is it a fly and what kind of fly is bothering our horse?
My understanding is our audience is in Minnesota and Wisconsin largely. Might be a few eavesdroppers. I'm going to pretend that everybody is in this part of the country, but beware if you were in the Southwest Desert or somewhere else, the problems may be slightly different. Horses respond to biting insects with all of the behaviors we just saw. Leg stomping is pretty much a dead giveaway for a certain kind of fly, but yet other biting flies can stimulate the twitching, the switching, the head batting, all of which from the cab of the truck says something's bothering them, something's biting them. The question is, what is it? I've given a list here of the 5 or so principal villains that we see up in this part of the country. And it's easy to think of them in 2 groups because of where they come from. what I call the aquatic biting flies, I'm not the only one, include several different groups of insects that all make a living by biting mammals and sucking their blood. And that process is painful. Some of you see gnats around the heads and the necks of horses, call them biting gnats. They're really black flies. Horse flies and deer flies are the second big group. They're larger insects. I'll show you them in a moment. And mosquitoes, of course, don't forget. They're not only biting people, they're biting everything else that has blood on the landscape. And all of those things together can bother horses. And what makes them a group is that they all develop as immatures, I'll illustrate that in a minute, in aquatic habitats, swamps, streams, rivers, and so forth. Here's a little bit of Bugs 101. All flies have a complex life cycle, we call it. All start as eggs, and what's shown here are maggots, and they get progressively larger by shedding their skins. They turn into a pupa, just like a butterfly turns into a chrysalis, and then we have the adult form. It's the adults that bother the horses, but wherever the adults are, you know the earlier life stages were present. And with the aquatic biting flies, those all came out of wet ground of some kind. Can you read that next one?
Yeah, I'm curious, Roger. I've got a question for you. As flies go through this life cycle, how far do they stray from where they were eggs, typically?
Well, the eggs to the pupa don't go anywhere. They're stuck where they grew up for the most part, or are growing up. It's the adults that have wings, and depending on the kind of insect, they can travel a couple of 100 yards, maybe the length of a football field. I guess that's 120 or so. Or they can go a half of a mile.
Okay.
And the main thing we're going to get around to, we're showing this insect is a example of a house fly. It and stable fly are the two main filth flies, and they can travel a half a mile easily.
Okay. So you know that they're breeding pretty close to your property if you've got a lot of them there.
Yeah, that's the first place to look.
Okay.
Very good. I like that. Okay. So the aquatic biters come from wetlands, and the problem that the whole group has is that the source reduction is not practical. We're not going to dam up streams to starve out black flies. We're not going to fill in swamps to get rid of horse flies and deer flies. You may do a little bit of water container control around your stable to control mosquitoes, but they're still coming in over the fence from the neighbors' places, probably the surrounding township. It's just not practical to manage them through source reduction. Filth flies, on the other hand, come from moist organic debris that accumulates where livestock are housed. I'm talking about rotting feed, soil bedding, piled manure, those kinds of things that are basically the food for the maggots. And the two flies that are most common around horse stables and other livestock premises in the upper Midwest are the stable fly and the house fly.
Okay.
We doing?
Yeah.
On the left here, you can see some images that convey the general gestalt, the appearance of aquatic biting flies. They're not to scale. The biting gnats or the black flies are tiny little things. They're going to be on the order of 1/4 of an inch long or smaller. Those things come from rivers, streams, and creeks. They need moving water. The second group are the horse flies or the deer flies. They're cousins, if you will. They're big. They can be 1.5 inches long. I've seen some hooters around here that are 1.5 inches long, great big black ones. Okay, I'm an entomologist. I can't help myself, but they're really exciting insects to watch. You horse people will say, what the heck is going on? These are biting flies. They're always females. They're after blood. Those insects develop in marshes, swampy ground, not moving water, not standing water, but their maggots, their larvae are actually feeding on other insects in those wetland habitats.
And horse people, you've probably seen those. We lovingly refer to those horse flies as the big black bombers.
Yep.
They irritate the horses more than anything. The deer flies, which Roger is mentioning too, typically when I see those is when I trail ride my horse and I go by a pond or a swamp or a marshy area. Those are the ones that flock to my horse's ears, to his side, sometimes even to me, and their bite stings pretty severely.
Big time. The smallest of them, or the faintest of them, I guess, is the mosquitoes. There are species that feed in the daytime, but the bulk of the ones around our Minnesota, Wisconsin area actually feed at night. They develop as larvae in still, shallow water, maybe 1.5 feet deep, not much more. They don't come out of lakes except right around the margins if they're gently sloped. They can develop in tires and other containers that collect water. But these insects are largely out at night, and if your horses are stabled in open areas, they're feeding probably a very large number of mosquitoes every night for the months of May through September. Okay, these are all in the group called the aquatic biting flies. They all come from aquatic habitats, and they come from distances away that you really can't manage. What we can do to deal with these guys is exploit their behavioral differences. Black flies and horseflies and deer flies don't like deep shade. They're inactive at night. They're only active during the day. And if a horse can get into a deep shaded place, like a barn, those insects will not go in after them. And so my recommendation is to give your horses choices rather than pen them out in the middle of nowhere and let all of these insects attack them. If they can get into a shaded area, deep woods or into a barn, that will allow them to manage their misery a little bit. On the other hand, the mosquitoes really need to, will come into dark areas. And so if they're a problem and you're trying to solve them without repellents of any kind, you should be approaching that by giving them screened indoor habitats. Close off the windows, close off the doors. The mosquitoes will try to get in at them, and a few will, but you'll exclude most of them. Keep them outdoors, just like we do when it's sundown and time for the picnic to move indoors, right? Mm-hmm. Horses will do the same thing if you let them. We need to give them screens to keep the mosquitoes out. So those are the aquatic biting flies. On your premise, again, it doesn't hurt to do wetland management to the extent that you can, but often it's impractical because it occurs, these insects are coming from places outside your fence lines, and in some places it's unacceptable to get rid of wetlands for a variety of legal and ethical reasons. Other options are to try to fog the area, and I've seen very high price stables in Florida and Louisiana actually hire helicopters to come in and fog the areas. Otherwise, people could spray the vegetation around them, but it's very difficult to keep up with nature's production. So really, source reduction and area-wide control is difficult. Control and to make your horses comfortable from aquatic biting flies is best done by things closer to the horses.
Great.
Their housing.
Sure.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Abby, do we have any questions coming in on these kids?
Not yet.
Good. Let's now move to the main focus of what Rachel and I are going to present today, and that concerns the filth flies. Again, what makes them a group is that they come from moist organic debris, usually connected with feed, feces, urine, those kinds of problems. And what's neat about that is that these insects, because they come from there, you can eliminate them by better managing the things that they develop in. Source reduction, we call it, otherwise sanitation. But we're not talking about vaccines against viruses. We're talking about pitchfork kind of sanitation.
Great.
Stable fly is likely to be the most one that everybody around here encounters. I would say from the middle of May, easily into early October, the insect that bites on the legs, and I apologize to you equestrians, this is actually a steer, but you see the second illustration, there's little black spots on the leg, those are stable flies. Mm-hmm. To the right, you'll see that there's each one has a proboscis. It's like a bayonet coming out from underneath its head. And to the left, you can see it in side view, left and right. To my right, you see this bulbous red abdomen. That's a fly that just got dinner, just fed on an animal, and as soon as they feed, they go perch in the surrounding environment. So really, we see less than 5% of the flies that are present actually on the horse at any instant. You need to realize that the environment is full of these things, and they're stacking up like planes coming into LaGuardia trying to get lunch each day. And you'll see the fed ones perching around in the environment, and that makes it really easy to identify them. This one bites. piercing, sucking, and it's the one that's causing the bulk of the behaviors that we saw in the video that Rachel showed moments ago.
So how long does it take for them to secure that blood meal?
They can feed in a couple of minutes.
Within a couple minutes.
So they're flying in, landing. If the horse isn't dislodging them, they'll start probing and get a blood meal, and they'll be gone in a couple of minutes easily. Okay. Horses are particularly irritated. It doesn't take many of these insects to cause horses to go ballistic. And the dead giveaway for these guys, if stable fly is biting, watch for those leg stomps. The other aquatic biters are going to be concentrated up on the body, but stable fly is going to be on the legs. Okay. The other one of the filth flies is more of an ish factor, a nuisance to us. This is called the housefly, and they have sponging mouth parts. They really can't bite. It's not possible, but they will light on animals, cause them to twitch their ears and bat their heads. They're feeding on sources of sugar and carbs in the environment, like that bucket of grain up there. These things are a nuisance to people, but they're not causing misery anywhere near on the magnitude of that's caused by stable fly. Again, what makes the filth flies a group is that those maggots, the larvae, labeled L1, L2, and L3, those guys are occurring in moist organic debris, feeding much like whales do on krill in the ocean. They're filter feeding nutrients from the gravy that's in that material, and in turn, if we can get it really wet, they can't get the oxygen they need, or if we get it really dry, they can't suck the gravy that they need. And those are the basics of managing the organic debris that produces these guys. And if we minimize the sources, we can minimize the number of adults that are bothering the horses.
Great.
Think about your premise and where organic debris can accumulate it. Think on the feed end of things. Where is feed stored and where is it fed? If it gets wet during summer months, it's highly likely to produce stable flies and maybe house flies if there's enough grain in the medium. Think about where animals are penned, indoors or outdoors. If you provide bedding of any kind, the animals are naturally going to soil it. If you pick your stable every day, no problem, but if you let it accumulate, then flies will colonize that. If you pick the stable and haul the feces outside and put it in a pile, you've just concentrated all the breeding material for all the flies, made it really easy to find it, and they will blow up in numbers and become overwhelming. Also think about waterers. That's a source of moisture, especially in dry times of the year. If water is spilled from a waterer and or feces or other feed debris accumulates around those waterers, that too can be a little hot spot for producing these flies. A couple of examples here. If you're looking carefully, you'll see this is after corn harvest, so it's not quite the proper illustration, but open mangers with hay falling on the ground. I know there's many reasons not to allow this to happen. Another one is that green material is going to produce stable flies, big time. I call it maggot heaven, but if you think of organic matter that's got the right moisture and the right temperature, flies will find it during the summer, and in turn the numbers will blow up around your premise. Try to prevent that from happening.
These spots are so common on farms that I visit. So do think about placement of your feeders, you know, where the water's running to in your pastures, and keeping that material out of those areas that would be likely breeding grounds.
Yep. Take it and pile it somewhere. Well, you see, there's always a little bit of gravy spot around the edge, and if in the summer when we get rainfall here, these kinds of piles can be teeming, certainly with stable flies, probably house flies. Hauling it to the back 40 may reduce the numbers a little bit around your place, depending on how far that back 40 really is. But pity the neighbors. This is actually somebody piled this manure next to a development, and in turn the flies are coming out. They don't know where the horses are. They're spreading out, bothering people in all directions. Got one more? Here we go. I've been on maybe 50 equine premises and twice as many dairies and so forth. And every place is different. The way people manage their feeds and their bedding and so forth, they're Heinz 57 variety the way you guys do stuff. And I understand why. What this means, though, is that if you're going to tune your sanitation program at your place, You really need to know where the larvae are breeding. Get to know it. Look periodically. This is a shot over my left shoulder. In my world, gloves and boots are optional. But what I've done in my right hand, I've got a garden trowel. This is all the equipment you need to do this. Just peck around and stuff any sort of piled organic debris, and look for fly larvae and pupae. They're big enough to see without a microscope. Kind of the next one.
I will say too that Roger is an expert troweler. I would guess if you offered him enough money, he would come to your property and do this for you because he really enjoys it and he's very good at it.
I'll actually settle for a free lunch.
Free lunch? Or a free beer.
Yeah, okay. Well, later in the day we can get stronger. Here's the point. Okay, you see in the top center there's this kind of chestnut colored thing. That's actually a fly pupa. And just below it, you can see the butt ends, pardon my French, of maggots. And then below that are two pictures. One of them on the left, the left image, that's actually not a smiley face. That's the hind end of a maggot. Oh, you have a pointer?
We have a pointer.
Damn. Okay, there's the pupa. And then down to like 7 o'clock, you see those two little black spots? Those are their breather ports. They breathe through those things. We call them spiracles. Good. And then to the right is a side view of a maggot. The head actually has a tapered end, and the butt is the blunt end. And there's nothing else that moves like that. Nothing else in these breeding habitats. If you find this insect, incidentally, this is stable fly. Housefly will look a lot like this, except their posterior spiracles will be a little different. You don't need to know the difference there. If you find maggots breeding in organic matter, you know that organic matter is suitable habitat at the time, and you can do something to either prevent it from accumulating or dispose of it in a way that prevents flies from breeding in it. That's kind of my bottom sermon from Reverend Moon today.
Thank you, Reverend Moon. We will continue.
The way you manage your premise, again, 57 variety, Heinz 57 variety of options. Ideally, this would be perfect for an indoor pen. Using shavings. First off, we know shavings versus straw. Straw, if you get it moist, it breeds a lot more flies than shavings. So if I can get you guys to stay away from shavings, at least during the summer months, or stay away from straw during the summer months, the fly breeding season, you can naturally minimize the amount of soil bedding that's more suitable for flies. Keep it dry. You see the water is in this dead center corner?
You can use the arrow.
Yeah. Oh, well, no, it's okay. I'll just wing it. Keep it dry and pick it regularly. Dried, I call them road apples, but horse feces. If you muck the stable and haul them outdoors, that's minimizing the material that's indoors, but be careful how you manage it next because you can be just concentrating the problem elsewhere.
So Roger, I do have a question about the use of straw. Many of the people who breed and have foals are using straw, and if they are smaller breeders, meaning they may only have 1 or 2 horses a year, they're going to be foaling later into the year as opposed to January or February. How can they manage that?
Can't. If you can't get them to go to coarser grades of shavings from straw, then just be aware that straw is a liability and be careful to spread it fast and keep it dry as best you can.
And actually, when I worked in England, all we used was straw, and you can turn over a whole straw bed. I recommend using a metal or an iron pitchfork to do that. It's easier than using a plastic pitchfork because it's a coarser material and a bit harder to scoop up feces in urine. But I would just recommend if you have to use straw, try and turn over the whole bed on a daily basis if you can.
There's always somebody willing to part you from your money for their equipment. And there's always somebody around that just loves to drive it like a four-wheeler in the summer. This is an ad for some outfit. What I really want to say is, if you said turn it daily, it's really not necessary. If you do it twice a week.
In the stall I'm referring to.
Okay.
You're talking about
either way. I'm saying if you let it sit for very long, I mean, the reason we have our garbage emptied about once a week is that's the time it takes for an egg to turn into a pupa. So if you disturb your stuff, and my preference is to spread it in small particles out in available ground if you have it, because that material will dry and erode quickly in nature. It will not produce flies. So you really want to convert the piled accumulated matter, straw, shavings, feces, and so forth that come out of stables or pens, either way, spread that out. And if you do it at a scheduled price per week in the summer, that's sufficient to keep flies from breeding that material.
Great.
So sanitation, a bunch of ways to do it. No place works for everybody, but it's not going to be perfect. And eventually, you need to start thinking about other options that you can provide.
Some things you can do inside your facility, there are a number of strips, traps. I asked Roger to identify the liquid material in this trap and toss, and he's got a term for that material. What was that, Roger?
I call it stink juice.
Stink juice. So essentially what that's doing is mimicking the scent of rotting debris or material in an effort to attract more flies and get them to get trapped and subsequently die in those traps. That is an option to varying levels of effectiveness, but it is an option. Another option you have that I see some of in Minnesota would be these fly nets that you can see in that middle picture. And you can put these up in doorways, windowways. You know, what we're looking at here is a stall door, you know, that a horse can often put its head out, but this is going to keep those flies from coming in your property. On the right, what we have is what we refer to as a fly predator species. And these will be native, otherwise you can actually order them and introduce them to your property. Yes.
Go back, please.
Reverend Moon, you've got it. Anything you want.
The containers, this was a particular brand, there's many others on the market. Those things do not attract stable flies. They attract house flies and other kinds of insects that really aren't pestiferous, like blowflies and such. If your problem is stable fly, this comes back to my initial point, know your enemy. Who are you trying to control? If it's stable fly, these things aren't going to be useless.
Got it. So those other flies hanging out, these might help. What do you think in terms of effectiveness?
Of which?
Well, a lot
traps?
of people like to use strips that they'll...
Oh, yeah, they'll catch a few. My experience is most people set them up, they feel good, they walk away, and they don't maintain them.
Okay.
These things will fill up and get putrid, but once they're full, they're not going to catch anymore. And it's often a game. If you don't have adequate sanitation, you're losing the battle because you're catching a few flies. A whole lot aren't getting trapped.
Okay. So when we talked about those fly predator species, here's how they work. And if you remember, Roger talked to us about the fly life cycle and stages. So what we're doing with these is trying to interrupt that life cycle. So essentially, that beneficial stingless wasp is an example of that. They will drill their eggs into the pupa of what would be a fly eventually. That egg turns into grub that'll eat and kill that fly pupa. And so that grub eventually turns into the wasp and turns into an adult, which continues that life cycle. Anything you want to add there, Roger?
Just don't get preoccupied by the word wasp. These are small insects. They could care less about people. They're not stinging like yellow jackets and so forth. These are obscure little ant-like insects that work their way around, searching for the pupae that manage to survive your sanitation program. These are not harmful to horses or people. And in certain circumstances, I think they're beneficial. In other cases, though, they're overwhelmed. If you have way too many flies coming out, developing the material. If you don't have good sanitation, the first point, you're dead.
This is what's included in the fly predators?
Fly predators, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other brands, too.
You can run into problems with effectiveness as well. If the neighboring farms by you have a fly problem and they're not managing it, these might not be very effective for you in your facility. So we, of course, at the U of M are unbiased, but these are a couple main brands that you'll see in terms of fly spray, Bronco, Ultra Shield. On the right, what I have, there are a lot of fly spray recipes out there online, and a little bit later I'll talk about an experiment we did testing the one. The most popular or common one is going to be your Avon Skin So Soft with white vinegar, citronella oil. You'll see some call for eucalyptus oil as well. But with these fly sprays, there's a pretty common theme or common ingredients. Typically, pyrethrin and permethrin are going to be your top ingredients. And the reason they're so popular, so listen, Reverend.
Okay, because they work. If the dose is high enough, they work as repellents. So stable flies and other insects come in to get that blood meal, their receptors get jammed and they get confused and they can't find the host. Pyrethrins are botanical products. These are materials that come from chrysanthemum-like species, mostly in East Africa. Permethrin is a synthetic analog to pyrethrins. It lasts longer. Citronella is an extract from, lemongrass, I believe.
Yep.
And pepperynyl butoxide is actually a synergist. It makes the other active ingredients work better. And there are other actives, effective ingredients in over-the-counter horsefly control products. These are the main ones. And the dose, the deal there is to have the dose high enough, long enough when you need it, so that you've got a barrier, if you will, like a force field around your horse that prevents those insects from landing and feeding.
I would recommend too, with these different sprays, take a look at the manufacturer's recommendations because they are going to vary a bit. We'll chat more about that in just a few minutes too. Okay. These are just a couple other examples that are out there and common in the market. Beyond sprays, you can find ointments, roll-ons. Typically, those are going to have, to some degree, pyrethroids, like we just mentioned, pyrethrin, permethrin. What we're looking at here on the left would be leg bands. These are citronella-scented bands that go on all four limbs of the horse to attempt to reduce the amount of stomping. There's also spot control that recommends being applied once every couple weeks. The efficacy of these products is not well known or understood, but they are available for you to try, and they've been tested on horses, and some people have a great amount of success with those. Roger, you added this picture, and I don't know if Roger's poking fun at horse people, but this is a little out of control. But this is what we do. We love our horses. We want to keep them comfortable.
Yeah, and that's an asset for horse people because they're willing to do more to make their animals comfort than, say, dairy or beef cattle managers. They're dealing with the same problems, but horse people have a few more options. Yeah, this is a little over the top.
Well, they can't look in the mirror, so they don't get embarrassed, at least we think, and their friends don't make fun of them. Yeah. But you have options, and the point that we're trying to drill home here is there are some measures you can take. For instance, looking at the next slide, fly masks are going to be incredibly common this time of year, covering the eyes, covering the ears. Some will even extend a bit lower down the nose. What we're looking at in that middle image are leggings, and these we'll talk about in more detail in just a little bit as well, but these are meant to protect the lower limbs, and that is the preferred feeding site for these stable flies, so that's an effort to keep that clear of flies. And then we've got a mesh fly sheet here, which is also pretty common. If your horse can keep them on and they keep them comfortable and keep them from overheating, by all means, these can be a great way to give them at least a little relief in the summer. So that leads me actually to a very exciting research update. A while back, we did a project at the University of Minnesota. And our question, because there is not a lot of data out there on how effective these stable fly protectants are. So we wanted to look at them and compare them a bit more. So our objective was to investigate the effectiveness between two commercially produced fly sprays, the citronella-based fly spray, which is the homemade spray that I mentioned, a physical barrier, and a citronella-scented leg band. We hypothesized that the fly sprays would provide the strongest barrier against flies. And so now you might be wondering, well, how did we measure this? So we took, over the course of 6 weeks, 6 horses, we individually penned them, we applied our fly spray treatments, and we sat in those lawn chairs and we observed behaviors that tell us that they're annoyed by the flies. Those behaviors we had to define in some way, so we were watching how many times they stomped their feet or stamped their feet. So this was identified by them raising a limb at least 1 inch off the ground and it coming back to the ground with some degree of force. So we're not counting the steps that they're walking, just that they're actually stomping or stamping. We looked at tail swishes, which is a common occurrence when they're trying to swat them off them if they're around the back. So anytime the tail crossed the center line, we counted that as a motion. Also, we counted up and down movement. And then we looked at twitches. At first, we tried to observe and count twitches all over the body, which proved to be impossible. So we localized this to the M. deltoideus muscle region, which is right over your horse's shoulder. And then we also looked at head backs. So a head back was defined as any time your horse brought their head down to a front limb, or if they brought it to the side. Sometimes they'll do this to try and bite or lick away flies that are causing them to itch, or biting and causing them discomfort. So again, we looked at those behaviors after applying our treatments. Here's what we used as treatments. We used a permethrin spray, and I've added some price information just for the sake of comparison, and if you haven't purchased these recently, typically a 0.05% permethrin spray is going to be about $20 per bottle. You can get it for cheaper. You can find it for $5 to $10 per bottle. Kind of like shopping at the grocery store though. Sometimes, you pay a little more for these, you're going to get a stronger formulation. You may get a bit better protection or more stability out of that chemical. Another treatment we did was a pyrethrin spray. And so around $17.99 per bottle, but again, a lot of variation depending on brand. This is the formula for the homemade spray we made. And when I calculated my ingredient cost, this came to $12.76 for a 32-ounce bottle. Again, we used white vinegar. We found our Avon rep and got a bottle of the Skin So Soft. We did water and then 1 ounce of citronella oil. And that citronella oil we found at GNC. Sometimes you can find them at supermarkets too, but that's where we found ours. And we mix those together and use them as a spray. We also used shoe fly leggings, and yes, that is spelled correctly. They are called leggings, and that's a trademark product. It's $55 for a 4-pack of those, so we did those on each of the 4 limbs. As you can see, they start around the coronet band and extend upward towards the knee or hock. And we also did the leg bands. Those are the citronella scented bands that you put around each of the 4 limbs. They come typically just above the fetlock, and those are going to be about $20 for a 4-pack. So again, our objective was to look at the effectiveness between these 5 different treatments. We also had what we'd refer to as a control horse that was untreated or didn't have any type of fly comfort treatment put on. I realize that this is a lot to look at. If you can follow me and stay with me on this table, I will talk you through what we found. So if we're looking at the top here, again, we were looking at 4 behaviors really highly associated with fly annoyance: the tail swish, the hoof stomp, the head back, and the shoulder twitch. We calculated averages on a per minute basis over that 2-hour time period that we were measuring the behaviors. Over here on the left-hand side, you see the different treatments that we use: the leggings, the shoe fly leggings, the citronella spray, the leg bands, the permethrin, the pyrethrin, and the control. If you're looking at this, something important to note, something that you might notice, these numbers have these little superscripts next to them, an A, B, and a C. All numbers with an A next to them are statistically the same. So even though this number is 36 and this number is 37, because they both have an A next to them, we consider those to not be different. Same thing if we looked at B, all the numbers with B would be statistically the same, same with C. So where you see differences, this 36 right here was, in terms of tail swishing with horses that received the citronella spray, that resulted in the lowest amount of tail swishing. And that is different from any treatment that has a B or C. So when we look at these as a column, we see the citronella spray and the leggings resulted in the lowest number numerically, with the permethrin, pyrethrin, and bands, and also our control horse that was untreated, being higher in terms of how it reduced or resulted in tail swishes. The next one that I would assume most of us horse people are pretty interested in would be the amount of hoof stomps based on treatment. Again, no hoof, no horse, and when horses stomp excessively, it's true, Roger.
I know.
No hoof, no horse. And when horses stomp in the summer, this can be really damaging to the hoof wall and potentially to the riding plans we have to do in the short summer we get. So what we found that was really interesting here, the leggings, the shoe fly leggings, and the citronella bands both resulted in statistically less amount of hoof stomps on a per minute basis than all other treatments. And so even though sometimes people look at those leggings and are like, well, you know, flies can still fly into them, they're not snug on the skin, we were pretty surprised to find that those worked really well in terms of reducing the number of hoof stomps per minute. When we looked at those head motions, while it might not make complete sense to us, the leggings were actually the most effective also at reducing the number of times that they brought the head to the side. It makes sense why it would be less for the lower limbs, but again, the leggings proved to be the most effective in reducing that fly annoyance behavior. And that would be followed by the citronella bands, shortly followed by the citronella fly spray. What we did see that was kind of interesting is our commercial products weren't as effective as we thought they would be or as we hoped they would be. As you can see, again, these superscript C indicate that these are highest frequency of behaviors, and they're higher, like I said, than the leggings and the bands. When we looked at the shoulder twitch, we saw that the citronella spray resulted in the lowest number of shoulder twitches, and with our sprays again being on the upper end in terms of that behavior. And so when we look at this as a whole, this next slide is a little bit wordy, but you can take a look at that if you'd like. The take-home message of this, no one treatment reduced all behaviors. However, what we saw is that the hoof stomps were reduced the greatest by the leggings and the bands when we compared it to other treatments. The sprays were among treatments, the citronella spray and pyrethrin sprays helped reduce tail swishes when compared to others. Headbacks were decreased by leggings when compared to others, and the citronella spray was most effective at reducing shoulder twitches among leggings and bands. Again, take-home message, not one of these reduced all behaviors, but there was some good effects seen, especially by the citronella spray and the leggings. So a future area of research that we feel, if people are going to continue researching fly sprays, you know, there's different levels of active ingredients, and you out there who have tried fly sprays have probably at times had more success than we did in our trials. So not all fly sprays aren't as efficacious as ours were, but there does need to be further work looking at how we can improve that to benefit our horses. Something we're seeing now too is fly resistance to some of these ingredients, so that could have come into play. It's not something we looked at in our study, but it's something for manufacturers to think about. Also, you know, we applied it the same amount by the same person every day, and it may be different from how you apply it at home. We went based on manufacturer recommendations, so that could be due to why we didn't see as much effectiveness as we wanted to, but these are areas that could be looked into in the future. So for our overarching take-home message, before we take some questions from you guys, hopefully we provided you some information on the life cycle of the fly, how to maybe do some cleanup or management around your facility, how to take some steps to improve comfort with your horses. Anything else, Roger?
Oh, but don't expect sanitation to be perfect. An option to make your horses comfortable is to apply something directly to them. We've explored some possibilities, but even then, no one is perfect. So just expect part of nature is to have some biting flies. Interpret it, help your horse survive as best as possible. Your compassion is great, but maybe don't be looking for miracles.
Good point. Thank you. And we'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Well, thank you both. I think this is very educational, definitely entertaining. We do have one question so far, and for those of you who are with us online, please feel free to use the chat box on your lower right-hand corner. Click on that little arrow to open up the chat and go ahead and type your questions in the chat box. Debbie asks, did any horses who wore the leg bands have any negative skin reactions in the area?
Good question, Debbie, because I, as a horse owner, have heard that from owners in the past. We did not see any of that. Something important to note, though, we only applied that as a treatment for 2 hours each day. So beyond that, I can't say for sure whether it would or not have a reaction to the skin, but in our trial, we didn't see any reactions.
So maybe some best practices for using leggings or bands would be daily removal or cleaning of any mud or debris, or what?
Yep.
Where would you go with that for other?
Absolutely. I would recommend checking those on a daily basis. You know, bacteria, infections like to thrive in dark, moist, open areas, you know, so if you've got a band, you're not supposed to put them super tight. You want to have a few fingers that can go between them, but I would say check the surrounding area, check the skin. Horses are all different. Some are more sensitive to materials than others. You know your horse, keep an eye on them and check.
Robin says, I have a manure pile about 10 acres away from the barn and pastures. Will it help to fly spray around the edges of this pile?
I'll take that one. It depends on what other piles are in the neighborhood, first off. And it depends on what you spray with. Most of the materials that I'm familiar with, you have trouble getting penetration. You really need like 40 psi and 100 gallons to treat a stable's worth of bedding debris. It's hard to get good control that way. I think you'd be better off if you could possibly avoid having to pile it, that is, spread it directly when it comes out during the summer, or alternative, if you could turn it up, and Rachel was talking about turning the straw inside the stables. Same works outdoors. What you're trying to do is encourage composting and get it good and hot. If you get it steaming, maggots are killed. That's great. But that may not be practical in operations. Some people have been champions for tarping, getting big chunks of say, landscape tarpaulins and laying it over the piles, again, to heat it and prevent flies from getting at it. Those are options you might consider if you think you have a stockpile. But first, what was the name of the person here?
That I think it was Robin.
Robin?
And she says there are no neighbors.
Robin, I taught you, okay, fair enough. I taught you how to trowel for maggots, right? Go buy yourself a garden trowel. I'd send you one if you sent me a note. And go picking around the pile and see if you can find maggots. That's necessary to justify any other actions. If you can't find maggots in there and look in the moist places, then don't worry about it. Again, no premise is the same, and month to month things change.
So best practices for composting, shameless plug, we will have some information coming, hopefully this winter, about manure management, and composting would be a part of that. So proper composting would be a way to manage that.
The trick is to turn maggot heaven into maggot hell.
Okay.
Okay, which means get it really hot. If it's hot enough for you to stick your hand in, maybe halfway up to your elbow, and you want to pull it back, that's hot enough to kill maggots. 140 degrees.
Fantastic. Hope that helps, Robin.
Cold stacking would be useless.
Okay. Julie says, it's my understanding from fly predators that I should pile the manure so that it will create heat, then kills the fly pupae.
That is composting. Problem is around the edges, it isn't going to get so hot. So you need to keep turning things, agitating it to get it through like 6 weeks of cooking. These fly predators will search wherever in the habitat wherever you release them, and if they find pupae, they'll sting and kill them. So it's sort of a mopping up exercise with the fly predators. But bear in mind, if you turn that manure and to get it cooking, you've cooked the fly predators too.
Oh.
So maybe those two aren't really compatible if composting is done well. But if you have parts of places you can't clean well, fly predators might be useful there. The bulk of the stuff, composting, it'll remove it from the landscape for the neighbor's flies.
Okay. Julie asks, what are your thoughts on the feed-through fly products?
So let me make sure I'm clear on what a feed-through fly product is.
Like a supplement that they would ingest, I believe, garlic?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, they actually do make these products for cattle specifically because there are such huge economic losses in the cattle industry due to pressure of flies. Right now, in terms of things that we use for horses, I feel like maybe a bit more anecdotal. People do like to use garlic as an ingredient. You can always smell in your barn if you are at a boarding facility, smells like Italian dinner down one aisle. It's getting garlic. Right now, I would say this, you know, I probably have to do a good literature review, but I don't believe the science supports a strong, you know, correlation between effectiveness against flies and feeding garlic in the diet. Do you know any different, Roger?
No, that is the research base. Right. Minnesota, I commend you, Rachel, for your PhD program and your research on the efficacy of these horse protectants. There's, to my knowledge, nothing's been done similarly looking at the efficacy of feed-throughs. The idea is that you feed an insecticide in the feeds of the horse, and it passes through sort of like oats for sparrows. Well, this is insecticides against flies. But bear in mind that the feed that's rotting around doesn't have that insecticide in it, right? So there's a fly source that is outside of the domain. Also, we don't really know how long the residues last in soil bedding and piled debris. So at this point, I would rather people spend their effort trying to clean up the place better to minimize the supply of fly breeding materials. We know that will work. It's iffy whether it's worth it to feed an insecticide to try to kill the maggots that are developing in a subset of those possible sources.
What about, I think sometimes people do it because the scent is pretty strong. Will it have any effect on deterring flies from coming close to the horse if they've got a garlicky smell to them?
Well, garlic is not insecticidal generally at the doses that we normally think of. So I don't know that anybody's looked at the effects of odors. I mean, I prefer mint myself. I think you horse people should feed mint to your horses to make the barn smell a lot better.
We do all the time. They eat peppermint.
Okay.
Mint flavored treat. Oh, we sure do.
Great, but I'm a little skeptical at this point. Sorry. But there's a need for research, which means you asked a question that nobody's really addressed yet.
We don't have a better answer right now. Sorry, but I would say if you feel like it's helping your horses, it's certainly, you know, not necessarily hurting unless you're overdoing it, but probably pretty limited effectiveness. We've got
Mary asks, I may have missed it, but is the EquiSpot effective?
So we did not test the EquiSpot in our research trial, and like I mentioned previously, if you guys weren't on, we try and be as unbiased as possible and just put out some examples of what you can use. Because we haven't tested that one, it's hard for me to provide a testimonial on whether or not it's effective. What do you think about the spot treatments, Roger?
No experience.
And those ones too, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, it's the same active ingredients as you would find in the sprays, and they do call for like 2 weeks between application periods. You know, and we found that when we sprayed some of those substances on them, they weren't beneficial even right after we sprayed them. So I guess, you know, not sure at this point. I don't know if there's any data out there on that one either.
There's an old adage, the dose makes the poison. Same goes for repellents. If we have low doses, you aren't going to get as much repellency as possibly higher doses. At some point you could overdo it. But I think the EquiSpot is permethrin. Is that correct?
Yep.
The active ingredient? Okay. The idea is you put a daub on the withers or the tail head, either one. It spreads in the horse hair's oil, and in turn, if there's any benefit to be had, it's going to be by diffusion from the point of application. I'd have to do some experiments to actually see if it's repellent at the original dose at the withers and whether it spreads down to the legs. Honestly, I'm a bit skeptical, but then I'm retired.
Oh, we just got a nice testimonial.
There's a few of them.
Yeah.
Jeannie says, thank you, now I know why the fly traps are not working. Robin would like to see some research on feed-through garlic. She's been using one of the supplements through SmartPack, which I believe we're all probably familiar with.
Yep.
And the fresh piles from that horse doesn't have very many flies buzzing around it when she picks, but it's expensive.
Okay.
And then Julie says, I'm using Solitude Insect Growth Feed-Through with Cyromazine?
Cyromazine.
Yeah. At $270 for 20 pounds. So those are some investments.
Tell us about
Cyromazine.
Thank you.
There's a class of insecticides that weren't on your list. They're called insect growth inhibitors. They monkey with the hormone system that controls that metamorphosis, going from larva to pupa, basically. And insects that are exposed to cyromazine as larvae have enough of it that their pupation process, that transformation, is interfered with, and they basically die as pupae. They can't make it on out. Again, dose makes the poison, and you need to have the active ingredient high enough in concentration where the maggots are, and have it where the maggots are if it's going to work. And so, again, like feed-throughs, the same limitations are there, whether you're killing them with organophosphates, which Raybon does, or with cyromazine, this Larvadex product, and there are other trade names too. It's a matter of exposure. Again, go back to your troweling, go figure out where your flies are actually coming from, and then build your program from there. If you're finding them in hot, fresh feces, then a feed-through would make some sense. If you're finding them elsewhere, then it doesn't make much sense to me.
That makes me curious about the feed-through products, on how it would go through that hydrochloric bath through their stomach, and just through the hundreds of feet of their
that has been solved. Trust me, by bioassays, we know that if it's intake at the right dose, which is amount of material per kilogram of horse, that's the measure, then the concentration will be high enough in the fresh feces to be insecticidal.
Okay.
The question is the fate elsewhere.
Right, okay. Fantastic. This is your last call for any questions that you would like Roger or Rachel to address. Enter them into the chat box. For now, I would like to give you a heads up on our next webinar, which will actually be in October. We're going to take the summer off because we're all enjoying our horse activities. Roger will be troweling for maggots.
Fishing.
And fishing, because that's what you do when you're retired.
Music.
And so we have a webinar coming up on care of your senior horse. So I know many of us have geriatrics in our barn. I refuse to admit mine are geriatric, but that will be a very good webinar coming up in October. And I am seeing no further questions in our chat box, so I'd like to thank Rachel and Roger for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to all of you that joined us online. And the recorded webinar will be available in the next few weeks online, so go ahead and share and spread the word and have fun troweling for maggots. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in.
Bye all.